mani padme hum. Om 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 mani padme hum.
What happens when one of the greatest discoveries in the history of archaeology is made not by an educated scholar, but by an illiterate vagrant? The answer? Jealousy wrapped in hypocrisy. Our story begins in the year 1900. Wang Yuanlu, the son of a poor peasant family from central China, has taken up residence in a derelict temple on the outskirts of Dunhuang, a small oasis town in the northwestern province of Gansu. The temple stands just opposite the Thousand Buddha Caves, a collection of hundreds of grottos dug out of a lonely cliff in the middle of the desert. Inside these caves was an unparalleled collection of ancient Buddhist art and antiquities spanning a period of approximately 1,000 years during the height of the Silk Road. Wang Yuanlu found the caves mostly abandoned. With the exception of a few Tibetan monks and the occasional pilgrim, the place had been largely forgotten by the outside world. Most of the caves were filled with hundreds of years of accumulated sand, and many were accessible only by scaling perilous ledges and makeshift ladders. The melancholy fate of the grottos reflected the misfortunes of Wang's own life. While still a child, he fled his village in the wake of a famine, eventually finding his way to northwestern China as a soldier. According to the inscription on his tomb, after his discharge from the military, Wang, having experienced life-shaking disasters, lost all interest in fame and wealth. He then donned the robes of a Taoist priest and set out to beg for his daily meals. Now Abbot Wang, he managed to beg his way to Dunhuang. Wang was of slight build, likely emaciated by decades of malnutrition. The British explorer Orel Stein, himself only 5 feet 4 inches tall, once referred to him as, quote, a queer little figure by my side. What he lacked in stature, however, he more than made up for in industry. After taking up residence in the abandoned temple, Abbot Wang made it his life's work to accumulate merit for the afterlife. This meant cleaning up the caves, restoring the artwork, and renovating the buildings. These things cost money, however, and Wang had none. So he made the arduous 16-mile trek over desert sands to the oasis of Dunhuang time and again, where he begged for donations and subscriptions to the temple. Stein, who met Wang in 1907, was impressed with the abbot's singular pursuit of his goals. His devotion to the shrine and to the task of religious merit which he had set himself in restoring it was unmistakably genuine, Stein wrote. When I thought of all the efforts, the perseverance, and the enthusiasm it must have cost this humble priest from afar to beg the money needed for the clearing out of the sand and the substantial reconstructions, I could not help feeling something akin to respect. It was clear from the way in which he lived with his 2 humble acolytes, and from all we had heard about him at Dunhuang, that he spent next to nothing on his person or private interests. Then, suddenly, as if by way of reward for years of humble suffering, Wang caught a break. While clearing out the sand in cave number 16, Wang noticed a crack at the top of a mural covering one of the side walls. Thinking that perhaps another room lay behind the cracked mural, Wang broke through the wall and made a discovery for the ages. In a cramped antechamber barely large enough for 2 men to stand were piled high more than 40,000 Buddhist sutras, Confucian texts, government records, works of fiction, and religious tapestries and banners, all untouched for nearly 1,000 years. Because Wang was illiterate, he could not distinguish the contents of one scroll from another. This minor impediment, however, would not stop Wang from pursuing his own interpretation of the value of this long-forgotten hoard of manuscripts. Over the next 7 years, Wang carefully selected the most complete and aesthetically pleasing of the Buddhist sutras and sent them as gifts to Chinese officials in neighboring jurisdictions. His hope was that these highly educated Confucian gentlemen would express their gratitude in the form of a donation for his restoration projects. In this hope, he was sorely disappointed. Despite numerous such gifts, not one official ever sent Wang a dime. Nor was their curiosity piqued as to the source of these splendid sutras. Wang was careful not to reveal the true extent of the supply, leaving the Chinese officials to presume the existence of no more than a few hundred manuscripts, and those already dispersed. It was not until 1907 that Oral Stein, in the midst of his second expedition along the Old Silk Road, decided to visit the Thousand Buddha Caves in person. Unlike the Chinese officials, Stein was determined to trace the manuscripts to their source. He found Abbot Wang to be, quote, extremely shy and nervous, with an occasional expression of cunning, which was far from encouraging. It was clear from the first that he would be a difficult person to handle. As a result, Stein mentally prepared himself for what he called, quote, a long and arduous siege. Stein, taking advantage of Wang's illiteracy, religious piety, and lack of other bidders, managed to secure the purchase of some 10,000 manuscripts for a sum which will, quote, make our friends at the British Museum chuckle, he later wrote. Key to Stein's success was his insistence to Wang that he himself was a pious devotee of Xuanzang, a famous Buddhist monk who had once traveled from China to India during the Tang Dynasty to procure Sanskrit sutras for translation into Chinese. Stein, then a civil servant employee of the British Raj in India, told Wang that he was retracing Xuanzang's intellectual and spiritual footsteps in reverse. Fooled once, Wang would not be fooled again. The very next year, the French sinologist Paul Pelliot paid a visit to Dunhuang and opened negotiations for another 10,000 scrolls. Though Wang had ceded the first batch to Stein for a mere 200 silver taels, Pelliot was now forced to pay 500 taels. In a letter to a colleague back in France, Pelliot expressed his frustration at Wang's business acumen. Though we have already agreed in principle on the acquisition of the Sanskrit manuscripts, he wrote, there is no end to the haggling over price. When Stein returned again in 1914, he found that Wang, who remained, quote, the tough customer of before, now demanded 4 times the price per scroll of what he had paid 7 years earlier. As Stein put it, Wang's shrewd sense of business had been awakened by the payments received from subsequent visitors to a keener comprehension of the money value of what he retained. What did Wang do with all this money? Exactly as he said he would do. During his second visit to Dunhuang, Stein recounted how Wang, quote, welcomed me cheerfully and showed with genuine pride the various new structures which his pious activity had created since I had last seen the sacred spot 7 years before. Nearby, Stein spotted a spacious guest house and a series of shrines, along with a garden well laid out with young fruit trees, rows of stables, and brick kilns. From the beginning, Stein had instinctively known that, quote, the temptation of money alone as a means of overcoming his scruples was manifestly useless. Wang had his scruples. They simply weren't shared by classically educated scholars or nationalist politicians. For Wang, the Dunhuang Cave Library was a pragmatic form of cheap economic capital, one that allowed him to curry favor with the gods by investing in the improvement of temple grounds and shrines. Without exception, every scholar who witnessed Wang's restorations regarded them with contempt. Stein referred to hideous clay images, gaudily painted stucco images, and hideous statuary in stucco. One Chinese scholar has characterized them as having, quote, no artistic value whatsoever. Before we join their chorus, however, we might ask the following question. Who has the right to determine what constitutes a legitimate use of the past? Is it the educated scholar, who professes scientific altruism, yet pursues a research agenda designed to glorify his own cultural heritage and political affiliations? Is it the uneducated peasant, who views the pharaohs as heathens and prefers to quarry their monuments for fertilizer? Or is it the detached historian, who leverages the arrogance of time and distance to criticize his ancestors for not adhering to future values? The answer is deeply unsettling. A legitimate use of the past tends to be whatever he who speaks loudest says it is. Abbot Wang cannot speak to us. As a result, his his actions have been mediated to posterity largely through the lens of those who were hostile to his agenda. Chinese scholars have been particularly brutal. One of the most eminent historians in Dunhuang studies has described Wang as, quote, the one who will be remembered in history as the person who stole the Dunhuang treasures and sold them to foreigners. His tomb should not be a tourist destination, but rather be kept standing in front of the caves as a shame pole. This is the same sort of attitude that prompted most archaeologists, Western or otherwise, to make a careful distinction between themselves, legitimate scholars, and what they habitually referred to as treasure seekers, motivated solely by greed. But Abbot Wang was no treasure seeker. We might refer to him more accurately as a subsistence digger. In other words, his interactions with the material goods of antiquity were motivated by a desire to maintain a basic level of subsistence amid living conditions that were far less privileged than those enjoyed by educated scholars. Scholars and politicians tend to speak far louder than subsistence diggers, but there is no objective reason to privilege the motivations of one over those of the other. There are only subjective ideologies which change over time. Abbot Wang was a shrewd businessman who got the better of everyone who visited his cave, Stein accepted. In 1910, the Chinese government in Beijing decided to haul away the remaining 20,000 manuscripts in his possession. Money that was earmarked for this transaction, however, was siphoned off by local officials before it ever reached Wang. In response, Wang succeeded in hiding away half of his remaining collection, with no one the wiser. These he proceeded to sell to future explorers from around the world, each of which was convinced that he had purchased the last of Wang's hoard at a suitably inflated price. They were all deceived. In the end, Wang financed continuous restorations to the Thousand Buddha caves well into the 1910s without any evidence that he ever indulged in a single worldly luxury. By the time of his death in 1931, Abbot Wang, by then over 80 years old, had almost certainly gained enough merit to enter the highest levels of the Taoist heavens. Abbot Wang was the most successful subsistence digger in history, the only one later deemed worthy of his own Wikipedia page. But even he could not hide from the mounting troubles of his day. Please join us next time as we explore Foreign Devils Be Gone in episode 16 of Indiana Jones in History.
Om Mani Padme Hum.